Some places do not forget the people who leave them, and some dogs can hear what the earth has been trying to say for years. The rain had already stopped by the time Ethan Walker crossed the old county line, but the world still looked soaked in grief. Thin ribbons of fog drifted across the empty Nebraska fields while the tires of his rusted Ford pickup rolled slowly over cracked blacktop that hadn't been repaired in decades. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with tired amber eyes and a coat darkened by road dust and dried rainwater. The dog stared silently through the windshield as if he recognized the road before Ethan did. Maybe he did. Ethan loosened one hand from the steering wheel and rubbed the back of his neck where tension always settled now, a hard knot that never truly disappeared after the divorce papers came in the mail 3 months earlier. 20 years of marriage had vanished into signatures, lawyers, silence, and cardboard boxes. The house in Denver was gone. The savings were gone. Even the framed photographs had somehow become things worth arguing over. In the end, the only thing Ethan kept was the old truck, a duffel bag full of clothes, and Ranger. The farm waiting at the end of County Road 14 was never supposed to belong to him again. His father had died 6 days earlier, and Ethan almost hadn't come. The funeral notice arrived through a voicemail from the county sheriff, spoken in the same tired tone people used when discussing storms or droughts. No emotion, just information. Your father passed in his sleep. Figured you should know. Ethan hadn't spoken to the old man in nearly 11 years. Not since the argument that split the family apart like dry timber under an axe. But now, as the truck rolled past miles of dead corn stalks rattling softly in the cold wind, he realized distance had not erased memory. The farm appeared slowly through the fog like something abandoned by time itself. The white paint on the farmhouse had faded to gray. The porch leaned several inches lower than he remembered. One of the upstairs windows hung crookedly, tapping faintly against the siding with every gust of wind. Beyond the house stood the old red barn, enormous and dark against the evening sky, its roof sagging beneath years of neglect. The windmill nearby turned once with a rusty groan despite there being almost no breeze at all. Ethan parked near the fence line and shut off the engine. Silence rushed in immediately, the kind of silence that made a man aware of every breath he took. Ranger climbed out first. His paws landed softly in the mud while his ears lifted high, alert. Ethan grabbed his duffel from the truck bed and stared at the house for a long moment. He expected anger maybe, or sadness. Instead, he felt something stranger. The place felt occupied, not by people, by memory. The screen door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled like cedar wood, dust, and cold iron. His father's old clock still ticked faintly on the wall above the fireplace. Ethan stood frozen beneath it while Ranger wandered room to room, sniffing corners carefully. Everything looked smaller than it had when Ethan was a kid. The kitchen table, the hallway, even the staircase. Years had shrunk the place somehow. Then Ranger stopped moving. Ethan turned. The dog stood perfectly still near the back window, staring toward the barn outside. His posture had changed completely. Tail rigid, ears forward, focused. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked quietly. Ranger let out a low growl deep in his chest. Not fear. Warning. Outside, darkness settled slowly across the farm while the old barn disappeared into shadow. Then Ranger did something he had not done since Afghanistan. He barked 3 times. Short, sharp, deliberate. Ethan felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Because somewhere beneath the sound of the wind, he could have sworn he heard something answer from inside the barn. The house groaned all night like it was settling deeper into the earth with every passing hour. Ethan barely slept. He lay awake on the old couch beneath his father's faded army blanket while pale moonlight drifted across the ceiling in slow silver bands. Somewhere inside the walls, pipes knocked softly. Wood creaked. Wind brushed against the loose siding with long whispering breaths that sounded almost human in the dark. Ranger remained awake near the front window, sitting perfectly still with his eyes fixed toward the barn outside. Around 2 in the morning, Ethan finally sat up and rubbed his face with both hands. The clock above the fireplace read 2:13. Every part of his body felt heavy from the drive and from the exhaustion that had followed him for months like a second shadow. Divorce had done strange things to him. Not dramatic things. Quiet things. He no longer cared what day it was half the time. Food tasted dull. Music annoyed him. Even silence felt louder now. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward the back hallway. His nails clicked softly across the wooden floorboards before stopping near the mudroom door. Ethan frowned. "You hearing mice again?" Ranger did not react. His ears remained pointed forward. Listening. Ethan grabbed the flashlight from his duffel bag and followed him. The mudroom smelled damp, carrying traces of old motor oil and cedar shavings from his father's workshop years ago. A rusted lantern still hung beside the door exactly where it had always been. Ethan touched it absent-mindedly, remembering being 10 years old and holding that same lantern while his father repaired fences during summer storms. Back then the farm had felt endless. Alive. Now it felt like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Ranger nudged the door gently with his nose. Ethan opened it. Cold night air rushed inside immediately. The fields beyond the porch stretched beneath thin fog while the barn stood dark against the horizon like a sleeping animal. Ranger stepped outside slowly. Ethan followed, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. The grass crunched softly beneath their boots. Somewhere far away a train horn echoed across the plains. Ranger stopped halfway to the barn and stared toward the old family cemetery behind it. 3 small gravestones sat beneath a dying cottonwood tree where generations of walkers had been buried since the 1940s. Ethan remembered funerals there as a child. Quiet services beneath gray skies and endless wind. Ranger growled softly again. Ethan swept the flashlight beam across the cemetery. Nothing moved. Still, something about the place felt wrong tonight. Not dangerous, just awake somehow. The dog suddenly walked past the graves and circled toward the back wall of the barn where weeds had overgrown the fence line. Then he stopped beside the old windmill. The rusted blades turned slowly overhead, even though the air was completely still. Ethan looked up at it uneasily. "That thing has not worked in years," he muttered. Ranger lowered his nose toward the ground and sniffed carefully around the base of the windmill. Then he scratched once at the dirt. Ethan stepped closer. The earth there looked darker than the surrounding ground, damp despite the dry weather. He crouched and touched the soil with his fingertips. Cold, loose, recently disturbed. Ranger whined low in his throat and backed away slightly. Ethan shined the flashlight downward again. Half buried beneath the dirt and weeds was something metallic. Just the corner of it. Rusted steel barely visible beneath the mud. His pulse slowed strangely. The same feeling he used to get overseas before discovering hidden explosives beneath roads and broken buildings. Instinct. Ranger barked once sharply into the darkness behind the barn. Ethan turned the flashlight quickly toward the trees, but there was nothing there. Only shadows and wind. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the ground, came a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he imagined it. A soft metallic clink, like an old chain moving far below the earth. Morning arrived pale and cold across the Walker farm, the kind of Midwest dawn where the sky looked stretched thin over miles of sleeping fields. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink holding a chipped coffee mug while weak sunlight filtered through the dusty curtains. The house felt quieter after what he had heard the night before, almost as if it were waiting for him to decide whether he believed it had truly happened. Ranger lay near the back door, but had not relaxed once since sunrise. His ears twitched constantly toward the barn outside. Every few minutes he would lift his head and stare toward the window with the same tense focus he used overseas before detecting something hidden beneath rubble or sand. Ethan set the mug down and rubbed his jaw slowly. "All right," he muttered. "Let us see what you were trying to tell me." The cold air outside smelled like wet dirt and rusting metal. Overnight fog still clung low across the fields while frost silvered the dead grass around the barn. Ethan carried a shovel over one shoulder as Ranger trotted ahead, moving faster now with clear purpose. The German shepherd led him directly back to the windmill behind the barn. The old blades turned lazily overhead again despite the still air. Ethan noticed it immediately this time. No breeze touched the trees. No movement crossed the fields. Yet the windmill kept rotating with a slow, uneven groan that echoed softly through the morning silence. Ranger began pawing at the same patch of dirt near the base. Ethan crouched beside him and pushed loose soil aside with the shovel. The metallic edge he had seen last night became clearer beneath the mud. It was not scrap metal. It was flat steel. Thick. Deliberately buried. His military instincts sharpened immediately. He cleared more dirt carefully until the outline finally emerged. A square hatch roughly 3 feet across hidden beneath layers of soil and weeds. Rust covered most of the surface, but one detail remained visible near the center. A faded Army Corps of Engineers insignia. Ethan froze. His father had served briefly in the Corps during the 70s before returning home to run the farm. Ethan had never once heard him mention underground structures or military equipment buried on the property. Ranger whined softly and stepped back. Ethan brushed dirt from the hatch handle and pulled hard. Nothing moved. Years underground had sealed it shut completely. He leaned closer, examining the hinges. The metal looked old but strangely well built, reinforced from below rather than above. Whoever designed it had intended to keep something protected underground for a very long time. Then Ethan heard it again. Clink. The sound came faintly from beneath the hatch. Metallic. Rhythmic. Not random. Ranger barked sharply and backed away another step, fur rising along his neck. Ethan pressed his ear slowly against the cold steel. For several seconds, he heard nothing except the distant cry of crows crossing the fields. Then came another sound, a low humming vibration somewhere deep below the earth. His pulse quickened instantly. Electricity. Impossible. The farm had partially lost power years ago, according to the sheriff. Half the wiring inside the house barely worked. Yet beneath the barn, something mechanical still hummed softly in the darkness. Ethan stood abruptly and stared across the property. The farmhouse windows reflected pale morning light, while the empty fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He suddenly remembered something his father used to say whenever storms rolled through Nebraska during harvest season. The safest things are never the ones people can see. At the time, Ethan thought it was another one of the old man's strange sayings. Now the words returned with uncomfortable clarity. Ranger circled the hatch anxiously before stopping beside the barn wall. His nose lifted toward a narrow window near the roofline, where faded sunlight touched broken glass. Then the dog growled low in his throat again. Ethan followed his gaze upward. Someone had painted words across the inside beam decades earlier, almost invisible beneath dust and age. He could barely make them out from where he stood, but one sentence remained clear enough to read. If the water dies, open below. Clouds rolled across the Nebraska sky by late afternoon, turning the fields the color of faded steel while cold wind drifted through the broken slats of the barn. Ethan stood beneath the painted warning on the support beam for a long time, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier to understand. If the water dies, open below. Ranger paced slowly nearby, restless now, his nails clicking against the old wooden floor while distant thunder murmured somewhere beyond the horizon. Ethan finally climbed the narrow ladder to the loft where his father used to store tools and winter feed decades earlier. Dust hung thick in the dim light that slipped through the roof cracks. Most of the shelves were empty except for rotting ropes, rusted pulleys, and a collapsed wooden cabinet leaning sideways against the wall. He almost turned back until Ranger barked sharply from the corner near the far window. The dog stood beside an old green army footlocker buried beneath stained blankets and loose boards. Ethan frowned. He had not seen that trunk since he was a teenager. He dragged it into the light, coughing as dust filled the air. The lock had already rusted apart years ago. Inside lay dozens of weathered notebooks stacked carefully beside old military maps and yellowed envelopes tied with twine. Ethan picked one up slowly. The handwriting on the cover belonged unmistakably to his father. Walter Walker, April 1987. Ranger sat quietly beside him while thunder rolled again outside. Ethan opened the first notebook carefully. Most pages contained strange measurements and diagrams he did not understand at first. Water flow calculations, soil depth readings, underground pressure notes. Then he found names, local farms, creek locations, chemical reports. His pulse slowed uneasily. Several pages later, another sentence had been underlined heavily in black ink. If the company reaches the aquifer, the valley dies within 10 years. Ethan stared at the words. Beneath them sat an old newspaper clipping folded carefully into the page. Lincoln Valley Mining Project approved by State Board. The article dated back more than 30 years. Ethan vaguely remembered arguments about mining companies when he was a child. Angry town meetings. Farmers protesting near the courthouse. His father returning home exhausted and furious for weeks at a time. Back then, Ethan had thought it was simply about land rights. Now the notebooks told a different story. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the staircase below. A truck engine echoed faintly from outside. Ethan closed the notebook quickly and moved toward the loft window. A dark pickup had pulled into the driveway near the farmhouse. An older man stepped out wearing a sheriff's jacket and a weathered brown hat. Sheriff Dale Mercer. Ethan recognized him immediately despite the gray hair and heavier frame. Mercer had known his father nearly his entire life. Ranger growled softly under his breath. Ethan descended the ladder and met the sheriff outside near the porch. As the first drops of rain began tapping against the roof. "Thought I might find you digging around out here," Mercer said quietly. His tired eyes drifted toward the barn behind Ethan. "Your father figured you would eventually." Ethan crossed his arms. "You knew about this?" The sheriff hesitated. Rain darkened the shoulders of his jacket while distant lightning flickered silently behind the fields. "I knew your father spent 30 years building something under that land," he admitted. "Never told me exactly what. Just said if the water ever started tasting wrong, the farm had to stay standing." Ethan looked back toward the barn. "Why keep it secret?" Mercer exhaled slowly. "Because some men would burn half this county down to get what is buried under your property." The wind picked up sharply then, rattling the old windmill until its blades squealed through the rain. Ranger stepped closer to Ethan's side, ears high and body tense. Sheriff Mercer noticed immediately. "Dog hears it too, huh?" Ethan frowned. "Here's what." The old sheriff looked toward the barn with an expression Ethan could not fully read. "The generator," he said quietly. "Your father swore it would still be running long after he was gone." Rain settled over the farm before nightfall, soft at first, then steady enough to drum across the barn roof like distant footsteps. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table beneath the dim yellow light above the sink, while Sheriff Mercer's words replayed in his mind over and over. The generator. Still running after all these years. Ranger lay near the back door, but refused to rest. Every few minutes the German shepherd lifted his head toward the barn as though listening to something only he could hear beneath the storm. Ethan stared at the notebooks spread across the table. His father's handwriting covered nearly every page. Flow rates, pressure charts, aquifer maps, entire sections marked with dates stretching back decades. One line had been circled repeatedly in black ink. "If they poison the spring, nothing survives west of the valley." Ethan exhaled slowly and leaned back in the chair. His father had not been building random structures underground. He had been protecting something. The realization settled heavily across his chest. Growing up, Ethan always believed Walter Walker cared more about the land than people. The old man rarely hugged anyone, rarely explained himself. He solved problems with silence and hard work instead of words. But now Ethan began to wonder if his father had spent his entire life carrying a responsibility too large to share. A sudden bark shattered the quiet. Ranger stood rigid near the mudroom door, ears high, tail stiff. Ethan grabbed the flashlight immediately. "You heard it again?" Ranger barked once more and pawed at the floor impatiently. Thunder rolled low across the plains while Ethan pulled on his jacket and stepped outside into the rain. Cold water soaked through his sleeves almost instantly. The barn loomed dark against flashes of distant lightning while the windmill squealed overhead in uneven rotations. Ranger moved fast now, leading Ethan directly toward the buried hatch near the base of the structure. The soil around it had softened from the rain. Ethan knelt in the mud and gripped the rusted steel handle again. This time it shifted slightly beneath his hands. He froze. Ranger stepped backward immediately, watching closely. Ethan planted both boots firmly into the wet ground and pulled harder. Metal groaned beneath the earth. Rust cracked loose along the hinges. Then, with a deep grinding sound that echoed through the storm, the hatch finally lifted several inches. Cold air rushed upward from below, carrying the smell of stone, oil, and damp cedar wood. Ethan shined the flashlight downward. Narrow concrete steps spiraled into darkness beneath the farm. The beam disappeared deep underground without reaching the bottom. Ranger stared silently into the opening, ears twitching forward. Then came the sound again. The low mechanical hum Ethan had heard through the steel earlier. Stronger now. Steady. Alive. Rainwater dripped through the opening while Ethan descended carefully one step at a time. Ranger stayed close beside him, muscles tense beneath his soaked fur. The farther they went, the warmer the air became. The storm sounds faded slowly above until only the echo of boots against concrete remained. After nearly 30 feet, the staircase opened into a narrow underground corridor reinforced with thick cedar beams and old steel supports. Small industrial lights glowed dimly along the ceiling. Not electric bulbs, powered by the farm above. Independent power. Ethan stared in disbelief. The system was still functioning perfectly after decades underground. Water pipes ran quietly along the walls beside old gauges and pressure valves. Ranger moved ahead carefully, nose low to the floor as though following a scent left years earlier. Ethan touched one of the walls. Smooth concrete. Professionally poured. His father had not built this alone. The corridor stretched deeper beneath the farm before turning sharply left into darkness. Ethan's flashlight swept across faded warning signs bolted to the wall. Water reserve access. Pressure control. Emergency filtration. His pulse quickened. This was far larger than a hidden shelter. Somewhere ahead, water echoed softly through the underground silence. Ranger stopped suddenly near another steel door at the end of the corridor. The German shepherd stared at it without moving. Ethan approached slowly and brushed dust from the metal surface. Bolted beside the handle sat a tarnished brass nameplate. Property of Lincoln Valley Reserve Project. Authorized by W. Walker. Then Ethan noticed something else beneath the nameplate. Fresh mud. Recent footprints. Someone else had been down there not long ago. The underground corridor felt warmer the farther Ethan walked, as though the earth itself had been holding its breath for decades beneath the frozen Nebraska fields above. Water dripped softly somewhere beyond the steel door, while the low hum of machinery vibrated through the concrete floor beneath his boots. Ranger remained close beside him, silent now, moving with careful precision through the dim light. Ethan crouched beside the fresh footprints near the doorway. The mud had not fully dried yet. Whoever entered this place had been there recently, maybe within the last day. A cold uneasiness settled into his chest. His father had hidden this entire structure underground for years, yet somehow somebody else knew it existed. Ethan gripped the steel handle slowly and pulled the heavy door open. The hinges groaned deep within the tunnel walls. Beyond the doorway stretched a massive underground chamber unlike anything he expected to find beneath an abandoned farm. Ethan stopped moving entirely. Ranger stepped forward first, ears raised high as soft golden lights reflected across his amber eyes. The room extended nearly the length of a football field beneath the property, supported by enormous concrete pillars reinforced with steel beams. Pipes carried flowing water through filtration systems built into the walls, while massive storage tanks stood silently beneath glowing pressure gauges. The air smelled clean, mineral-rich, alive. Ethan walked slowly into the chamber, while his flashlight swept across rows of equipment covered in decades of careful maintenance. Water maps lined one wall beside hand-drawn engineering schematics and weather records dating back more than 30 years. His father's handwriting covered everything. Ranger trotted ahead toward the center of the room, where a narrow underground stream flowed through a reinforced stone channel beneath glass monitoring panels. Ethan stared in disbelief. Crystal clear water moved quietly through the underground system with the steady rhythm of a living heartbeat. Then he noticed the photographs. Dozens of them pinned carefully along a corkboard near the control station. Families, farms, school children standing beside wheat fields, old church gatherings, county fairs. Nearly the entire valley had been documented there over decades. Beneath one photograph, his father had written a single sentence. Everything above survives because of what flows below. Ethan swallowed hard. He finally understood. This was not a bunker. It was protection. His father had secretly built an underground purification and reserve system tied directly to the valley's aquifer. If contamination ever reached the groundwater, this place could keep clean water flowing to half the county. Ranger stopped suddenly beside an old wooden desk near the far wall. The dog sniffed carefully at something resting on top. Ethan approached slowly. A tape recorder sat there beside a yellowed envelope with his name written across the front in familiar handwriting. Ethan Walker. The sight of it tightened something deep in his chest. He picked up the envelope carefully while Ranger remained beside him, unusually calm now. Inside rested a folded letter and an old brass key attached to a military dog tag, stamped W. Walker. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly. If you are reading this, Then Ranger found what I prayed nobody else would first. There are people who will try to take this place once they realize what sits beneath the farm. They will call it progress. They will call it business. But water is not business. Water is life. I could not protect this forever alone. Ethan lowered the letter slightly. The room suddenly felt impossibly quiet around him except for the steady movement of flowing water beneath the floor. Ranger pressed gently against his leg, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Ethan looked back, toward the tape recorder. Dust covered most of it except the play button. Recently touched. Someone had already listened to it. Then every light inside the chamber flickered once. The hum of the generators deepened sharply. Ranger's ears shot upward instantly. A distant metallic door slammed somewhere deeper within the underground structure. Ethan turned toward the darkness beyond the filtration tanks while Ranger growled low in his throat. They were no longer alone beneath the farm. The underground chamber fell silent except for the movement of water beneath the floor and the low mechanical pulse of generators hidden somewhere beyond the filtration tanks. Ethan slowly folded his father's letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket while Ranger stood motionless beside him, staring toward the dark corridor beyond the main reservoir. The German shepherd's posture had changed completely again. Focused. Listening. The same look he carried overseas moments before danger revealed itself. Ethan reached instinctively for the flashlight clipped to his belt and swept the beam toward the darkness. "Who is down here?" he called out, his voice echoing softly through the massive chamber. No answer came, only the distant hum of machinery and the faint dripping of water from overhead pipes. Then footsteps moved somewhere beyond the concrete pillars. Slow. Careful. Ethan's muscles tightened immediately. Ranger barked once sharply and stepped forward. A figure finally emerged from the shadows near the far side of the chamber. Sheriff Mercer raised one hand calmly as he walked into the light. His old rain jacket glistened with water while mud covered his boots nearly to the knees. "Easy," the sheriff said quietly. "I figured you would find the lower level tonight." Ethan exhaled sharply. "You followed me?" Mercer nodded once. "Your father asked me to watch this place after he was gone. Said if anyone besides you found the hatch first, the valley would be in trouble." Ranger lowered his growl slightly, but remained tense. Ethan glanced around the enormous underground system again. "How many people know about this?" "Very few," Mercer admitted. And that was the point. The sheriff walked slowly toward the flowing water channel at the center of the chamber. Reflections from the underground lights shimmered softly across the surface while rain echoed faintly through the ventilation shafts above. 30 years ago, a mining company wanted drilling rights beneath half this county, Mercer explained. Most folks thought they were after limestone deposits. Your father discovered they were sitting directly above the aquifer that feeds every farm west of Lincoln Valley. Ethan listened silently. He tried warning people, Mercer continued. Nobody wanted to hear it. Too much money involved. The sheriff rested one weathered hand against the concrete railing overlooking the filtration system. So Walter built this place instead, piece by piece, year after year. Quiet enough nobody paid attention. Ethan shook his head slowly in disbelief. He built all this under a farm? Not alone. Mercer pointed toward old photographs pinned along the wall. Engineers, farmers, volunteers, church groups, entire families smiling beside construction equipment decades younger than Ethan remembered. People helped in the beginning. Then funding disappeared. Threats started showing up. Folks got scared. Ranger suddenly turned toward the far corridor again and barked sharply. This time both men heard it. A truck engine above ground. Heavy tires crunching slowly across wet gravel near the farmhouse. Mercer's expression hardened instantly. That will be them. Ethan frowned. Who? The sheriff looked toward him carefully. Briar Ridge Development. Ethan recognized the name immediately from signs posted along highways throughout Nebraska. Luxury housing projects. Corporate farmland acquisitions. Mercer continued quietly. They have spent 15 years buying property around the valley. Most folks think it is for real estate. Truth is they have been trying to reach the aquifer the entire time. Ranger paced anxiously now, ears pinned back as another engine joined the first outside above them. Ethan felt the floor vibrate faintly beneath his boots. Multiple vehicles. How do they know about this place? Mercer hesitated before answering. Because somebody finally talked after your father died. Ethan stared at him sharply. Who? The sheriff looked away toward the glowing water below. Your ex-wife's attorney works for Briar Ridge now. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. For a moment, all he heard was the rushing water beneath the chamber floor. Every sleepless night after the divorce, every missing document, every strange phone call during the settlement suddenly rearranged themselves into something colder. Ranger moved beside Ethan immediately, pressing against his leg as though sensing the shift in his breathing. Above them, thunder rolled across the plains while heavy footsteps crossed the barn floor directly over their heads. Rain hammered the barn roof above them, while the underground chamber glowed with soft amber light beneath the earth. Ethan stood motionless beside the flowing water channel, trying to steady the storm now rising inside his chest. His father had spent decades protecting the valley. His marriage had quietly collapsed around secrets he never understood. And now strangers walked across the farm above them, searching for the very thing Walter Walker died trying to hide. Ranger pressed close beside him, silent but alert, his amber eyes fixed toward the corridor leading back to the staircase. Sheriff Mercer lowered his voice carefully. There is still something your father wanted you to see before anyone else found this place. Ethan looked toward him. The old sheriff nodded toward the tape recorder resting on the desk beside the filtration monitors. Walter left one final recording. Said it was only for you. Ethan hesitated before sitting slowly at the desk. The recorder looked ancient beneath the dust, its metal edges worn smooth by years underground. Ranger rested beside his chair while thunder rolled faintly through the ventilation shafts overhead. Ethan pressed the play button. Static crackled softly through the chamber. Then his father's voice emerged from the speaker. Older than Ethan remembered. Slower. Tired. If you are hearing this, son, then the farm finally called you home. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Walter paused for several seconds before continuing. I know I was not an easy man to understand. Truth is, I spent most of my life trying to hold this valley together quietly enough that nobody noticed the cracks. Water flowed steadily through the underground channels nearby, while the old voice echoed softly through the chamber. Back in 1987, the state approved drilling contracts under Lincoln Valley. Most folks believed the companies would stop at the limestone shelves. They did not know the aquifer below us connected to every creek, every farm, every church well for nearly 60 miles. Ethan stared at the moving water beneath the lights, while Ranger listened silently beside him. I could not stop them legally, Walter continued. So I built this place instead, piece by piece, hidden enough to survive greed, strong enough to keep clean water flowing if the surface failed. The old man coughed quietly somewhere within the recording. Ethan suddenly realized how alone his father must have been carrying such a burden for decades beneath an ordinary farm nobody thought twice about. Then Walter's voice softened further. I know you hated me after your mother passed. I know you believed I cared more about dirt than people. But everything I built down here was for people. I just never learned how to say that properly. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Memories surfaced slowly through the years between them. His father fixing broken fences through snowstorms without complaint. Delivering water tanks during drought seasons. Quiet acts of service nobody noticed because Walter Walker never asked for recognition. If the valley still has water when I am gone, the recording continued, then it belongs to the people, not corporations, not politicians. Promise me you will remember that. The tape clicked softly before ending. Silence settled heavily through the underground chamber, except for the steady hum of generators and flowing water. Ethan sat there for a long moment, unable to speak. Ranger rested his head gently against Ethan's knee. Sheriff Mercer looked away respectfully toward the filtration tanks. Above them, truck doors slammed outside in the rain. Voices echoed faintly across the barn floor overhead. Ethan stood slowly and wiped one hand across his face. Something inside him had shifted quietly during the recording. The exhaustion, the bitterness, even the loneliness he carried since the divorce no longer felt quite as heavy. For the first time in years, he understood that coming home had not been punishment. It had been purpose. Ranger suddenly lifted his head sharply toward a blinking red monitor across the chamber wall. An alarm light flashed beside one of the pressure systems connected to the western pipeline. Mercer stepped toward it quickly. That line feeds half the valley, he muttered. Ethan moved beside him and stared at the screen. Chemical contamination levels were rising fast somewhere upstream beyond the farm. The sheriff looked at Ethan grimly. They already started drilling. 3 weeks later, the rain finally stopped over Lincoln Valley. Morning sunlight spilled softly across the Walker farm, while golden fields swayed beneath a slow autumn wind that no longer felt cold. The old barn still stood against the horizon, weathered but alive again, its broken roof repaired board by board beneath Ethan's steady hands. Fresh paint covered the faded walls now. The windmill turned quietly overhead, no longer groaning like something wounded. Ranger slept near the porch steps with his head resting across his paws, finally peaceful for the first time since they arrived. The valley had changed quickly after the underground reserve became public. Sheriff Mercer released Walter Walker's records along with decades of engineering reports proving the aquifer contamination spreading beneath the western county lines. Within days, state investigators halted Briar Ridge Development's drilling permits, while environmental teams flooded the valley with testing equipment and emergency crews. Farmers who once planned to sell their land gathered together instead beneath church roofs and grain silos, protecting the water system Walter built in silence beneath the farm. Most of them had never known the old man spent 30 years safeguarding their future underground. Now his name moved quietly across the valley like rain after drought. Ethan stood near the fence line holding a coffee mug, while pale sunlight warmed the fields around him. The air smelled different now, cleaner somehow, alive. Across the road, several trucks slowly approached the farm entrance carrying lumber, roofing supplies, and volunteers from neighboring towns. People waved as they passed. Some stopped to shake Ethan's hand. Others brought food, tools, or old photographs of Walter helping their families through floods and droughts decades earlier. The stories never stopped. Quiet kindnesses nobody talked about until now. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and trotted toward the gravel driveway. Ethan smiled faintly as Sheriff Mercer climbed from his truck carrying a stack of folders beneath one arm. "Morning," the sheriff called. "Looks like this place is turning into the busiest farm in Nebraska." Ethan glanced toward the barn, where volunteers repaired siding beside younger veterans recently arrived from Lincoln and Omaha. "That is kind of the idea," he replied quietly. Beneath the barn, the underground reserve now operated openly under county protection. Engineers worked alongside environmental teams maintaining the filtration systems Walter designed, while fresh water continued flowing safely through the valley pipelines. But Ethan had decided the farm itself would become something more than protected land. The old farmhouse had already begun transforming into a retreat for struggling veterans passing through the Midwest with nowhere left to go. Spare bedrooms were repaired. The workshop reopened. Empty silence slowly gave way to coffee brewing at sunrise, boots crossing old wooden floors, and quiet conversations late into the evening. Ranger moved naturally among the visitors like he understood exactly why they had come. Some nights he would rest beside men who could not sleep. Other mornings he would wait beside the barn doors as though guiding them somewhere deeper than the underground tunnels themselves. Ethan often watched the dog quietly during those moments. Somehow Ranger had known all along that the farm was never simply a place to return to. It was a place waiting to heal what life had broken. Sheriff Mercer handed Ethan one final envelope before leaving. "Found this in your father's desk after the county hearing," he said softly. "Thought you should have it." Ethan opened it slowly after the sheriff drove away. Inside rested a single photograph. Walter Walker stood beside a much younger Ethan near the windmill almost 30 years earlier. Both covered in dirt. Both smiling despite themselves. Written across the back in faded ink were the words, "Some things worth protecting only grow stronger when passed on." Ethan stared at the photograph while wind moved gently across the fields around him. Ranger returned quietly and sat beside him facing the horizon where sunlight stretched endlessly across the valley Walter spent his life protecting. For the first time in years, Ethan no longer felt like a man who had lost everything. Standing there beneath the wide Nebraska sky, with the old farm breathing softly around him and his loyal German shepherd at his side, he finally understood something his father knew long ago. Sometimes life takes everything away from a man only so he can return home empty enough to receive what truly matters. Hi friend, before you go, if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you why respect matters, please hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and share this video so more people around the world can hear stories that deserve to be heard. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. Thank you for listening story.